One of the biggest lies, one of the biggest cover-ups over the past few years as it relates to Russia and Ukraine is that the United States has been an innocent bystander, that they've been watching from afar as Russia suddenly decided in 2022 to invade Ukraine out of the blue. Of course, the story is much darker than that and goes back more than 35 years. How the United States and NATO built up an apparatus to try to destroy Russia. This is true. And our next guest, former CIA analyst Larry Johnson, has been spending an inordinate amount of time putting together an enormous body of research about how the United States, through massive military operations and NATO, built up the modern Ukrainian army, all with an effort of destroying Russia. He's written extensively about this in a multi-part series, and we wanted to have Larry on now to discuss this and go into it. Larry, great to see you again. It's been too long.
Yeah, man. Always a pleasure.
So you've been doing a lot of research over the past couple of years, and you put them together in a series of, really interesting reports on your website, which we'll link up here, about this long history with the United States and NATO trying to destroy Russia. What was the impetus for you with this project?
Listening to the lies, and I wanted to have the documented evidence to debunk them. Number one, Ukraine has been a de facto member of NATO since 1995. And I make that assertion on the following. One of the queries I asked was, out of 28 NATO nations, how many countries, and I didn't limit it to just NATO countries, but I said, how many countries have hosted NATO military exercises? The country that has hosted the most, it was listed number 6. So it's hosted more exercises than 22 other NATO countries, Ukraine. Think about that. How in God's name is Ukraine one of the major hosts for NATO exercises when it's, quote, not a member of NATO? The only thing it doesn't do with NATO is, number one, it's not covered by Article 5. Number two, it's not required to make a financial commitment. But when you go back and look at the history of the development of these and I use the military exercise as the entry point, because I spent 23 years scripting counterterrorism exercises for U.S. military special operations forces, for JSOC, SOCOM. And in the course of that, I spent a lot of time with the European Command, which is based in Stuttgart, Germany. The Africa Command, also based in Stuttgart, Germany. The Pacific Command, now called Indo-PACOM, which is based in Hawaii. Those were the principal three. And then Central Command, of course, which is based up the road here for me in MacDill Air Force Base. These military exercises is not a bunch of guys out there doing jumping jacks and push-ups. That's not what we mean by exercise. Exercises run the gamut from doing communications, testing communications between different units, to actual field exercises where specific military units are tasked in response to some event to get themselves organized, deployed, and then prepared to carry out a specific military mission. Over the course of these 30, because the first ones were started to be carried out in 95. In 1997, NATO began using a base in western Ukraine called Yavoriv. If you recall, on March 13th of 2022, Russia hit Yavoriv with some hypersonic missiles. It killed a bunch of foreign military personnel. That was early on in the war. But what I came to discover is Yavoriv was set up as an official, basically NATO base going back to 2007. So what we have here is this continued evolution, number one, of the growth of these NATO military exercises. Then I asked another simple question. Why the hell did we expand NATO when the Russian military from 1991 to 2011 decreased in size by 2/3. It went from 3.5 million to 1.3. Now, I could understand making a case that we got to expand NATO because the Russian military is growing, that the Russians are carrying out these military activities around the world. But it was not true. None of that was true. It was all a big lie. And for Donald Trump to sit there and pretend like he's Butterfly McQueen from Gone with the Wind. I don't know nothing about birthing no babies, Miss Scarlett. That, oh, this war in Ukraine, I don't know nothing about it. That's Joe Biden and that's Barack Obama. You know what? That's what my friend Ray McGovern calls male bovine excrement, the MBE. Because under Donald Trump, the Ukrainian military quadrupled in size. Didn't quadruple under Barack, didn't quadruple under Biden, quadrupled under Donald Trump. And during Operation Seabreeze, which was carried out, I believe, in March of 2017. Who's president? Donald Trump. What does that exercise include? It includes anti-submarine warfare, amphibious warfare. Wait a second. I thought these exercises were supposed to be defensive. We were protecting ourselves against a Russian invasion. Instead, I can show you a video of U.S. Marines in landing craft landing on the Black Sea shores of Ukraine. Now, if you're Russia sitting there watching the West saying, what the hell are they doing? And then in September of 2020, who is president? Oh, that'd be Donald John Trump. His Pentagon allowed B-52 bombers to fly along the Crimea coast. For what purpose? So when you go back over the history of this, and, you know, the pivotal year in all of this was 1999. Bill Clinton's president. Follow the timeline here. On March 12th, Bill Clinton welcomes in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as new members of NATO. Despite the Jim Baker previous promise under George H.W. Bush to not move NATO 1 inch east. Instead, broke that promise. 2 weeks later, NATO attacks Serbia. And in attacking Serbia, it's a Russian ally. Russia tries to send some equipment, reinforcements to Serbia. NATO blocks Russia. Then jump ahead. August 7th, the Second Chechen War begins. The Chechen War, Chechens were a bunch of Sunni Islamic radicals. They brought in people connected to ISIS and other things and began attacking inside Russia. The Central Intelligence Agency was involved with supporting the Chechens. That was on August 7th. August 9th, 2 days later, Boris Yeltsin names Vladimir Putin as prime minister. And it's 4 months later, the end of December, Yeltsin suddenly resigns, Putin becomes president. What was happening is the Russians thought they could get along with the West, thought the West would be our friends. And instead of us bringing the Russians into NATO, we created Russia as a non-existent threat, but claimed it was a threat because our military industrial complex needed to grow. They had to have an enemy, and by God, Russia was going to be that enemy.
Putin had asked, this is something that I think has been confirmed multiple places, that Putin had asked Bill Clinton, I think one to become friends, partnership. I think he ask Bill Clinton at the time to actually become part of NATO?
Yes,
and
no, he did.
It was during Clinton, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, you can see that book over my shoulder. You know Scott Horton from Provoked. He details it, documents it in great detail.
What was the reasoning for both Putin to ask to become part of NATO, and what was the reasoning from the Clinton side to say no to that?
Well, the Clinton side understood that if they did that, they would no longer have a justification to build, up the budget. I guess back then the defense budget was like $400 billion. Think about that. 400. Now we're up to $1 trillion. Putin wasn't the first one. Boris Yeltsin, right after this collapse of the Soviet Union, had approached the the then H.W. Bush administration about joining NATO, and then made that same inquiry with Clinton in early years. Putin reiterated it. The West could not afford to have Russia in, because then it could no longer, NATO would no longer have a reason to exist. The only reason for NATO was to stop a Soviet advance into Eastern Europe, which was actually never really the intent of the Soviets. All the Soviets did at the end of World War II, and understandably so, was they created a buffer state, a series of buffer states with Poland, with Romania, with Hungary, with Czechoslovakia, because it had been invaded twice in the previous, three times, I guess, in the previous 150 years, and they wanted to put a stop to it. Now, the West interpreted that, said, "See, this is a communist global revolution." It was all a lie, but it was designed. We got this military-industrial complex that had to be fed. So NATO became the vehicle for justifying this. And again, just step back. We can look. It's documented what the size of the Russian army was. The Russian army was not increasing in size; it was diminishing in size. And yet the argument was, "Oh yeah, boy, we got to build up NATO to stop that Russian expansion." Or you've heard the other lie that's put out there is, "Oh, Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Empire." Well, Vladimir Putin's not the country with 700 plus military bases scattered around the world. That would be us, the United States.
You worked in the CIA. How do you interpret the intelligence assessments then that supported this idea that NATO needed to expand? I mean, where were there dissenting views within the intelligence community, like regarding the potential risk of this? They're saying, CIA, the State Department, we need to expand. We need to expand. We need to expand NATO. And yet what you're pointing out is that Russia was actually shrinking. The size of its military was shrinking. So what were they basing this on?
It was based entirely upon the intervention of the U.S. military, the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics, the Boeings. There's money to be made there. And money's not going to be made if they're not, number one, if you're not having to sell these new weapon systems to these new NATO partners. That was part of the scam. You bring these people in, and then they hey, so we can have interoperability, you got to buy our stuff. If there were dissenting voices at the CIA, they didn't last long. Remember, this is a bureaucracy. You don't get promoted and put into leadership position by being a contrarian, by saying something that the White House doesn't want to hear. And the White House didn't want to hear this. It was, Clayton, there were public voices like George Kennan, who had been sort of the father of the Cold War in some aspects, coming out and saying, this is crazy. There's no need to expand NATO. In fact, NATO has outlived its usefulness. Don't do this. Bill Burns, the recent CIA director under Biden, who had been a U.S. ambassador in Moscow, wrote that famous cable in 2008 that said, with respect to expanding NATO into Ukraine and Georgia, it's a red line for the Russians. They'll fight it. Niet means niet. What's interesting is you go back and look at that period from December of 2007, when Vladimir Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference. Just remember, we just had a Munich Security Conference a couple of months back where J.D. Vance spoke. And oh boy, it created a real uproar because basically he told the Europeans they were acting like a bunch of authoritarian thugs and to stop it. Well, it was at that kind of setting that Vladimir Putin spoke and warned against the expansion of NATO. And then in March of 2008, you had the NATO conference, and he again appeared at that NATO conference, and Putin made very direct threats even, that if you guys persist in doing this, we're going to have to take counteractions. And then it was in August of 2008, at the instigation of the West, that you had these two territories inside Georgia erupt and attack Russian positions, and the Russians responded, shut it down within 2 weeks. But that then all evolved until we get to 2014, the Maidan. And we just learned in the last week from a documentary being prepared about Putin's 25 years in leadership that Russia wanted to respond militarily to that coup, to what happened in Maidan in 2014. But he said we were economically and militarily unprepared to do it. And so they spent the next 8 years getting ready. And it was, again, this was provoked. At no point, all Donald Trump had to do was tell the Pentagon during his time, hey, we're going to cut back on these military exercises on the borders of Russia. This is too provocative. We don't need to establish new bases in Poland and Romania. Too provocative. I'm not selling javelins to the Ukrainians. But Trump didn't do it. He did just the opposite. So you can't sit there and pretend now like he's some neutral mediator when he's as much a facilitator of this bloodshed as Joe Biden or Barack Obama.
It's a great point. One thing that sticks out to me, though, is that all of this, everything that you've documented here, all of these NATO exercises inside of Ukraine, the expansion, the money, the weapons, the expansion of the Ukrainian army, basically as a NATO proxy.
Right.
All in an effort to destabilize and destroy Russia. Why did they stop at keeping Ukraine out of NATO? I mean, by all accounts, they are a member of NATO.
Yeah.
Why just keeping the name? Why just not allowing them to have full membership in NATO? What was that strategy? Because wouldn't that have done more to provoke Russia by officially bringing them into NATO than not?
Well, I think that was their fear, that if they crossed that line, that Russia would have been compelled to act with even more force militarily. Understand that there are two papers that were written for the U.S. government. One was by RAND Corporation in 2019. It was, I think, produced for both DOD and the intelligence community. And it talked about how they needed to take efforts to basically weaken Russia. What could we do to weaken Russia? And all of this with an eye towards what to do about China. Now, see, this is not just about Russia. This is about China and about the United States maintaining what the U.S. perceives as its control of the world. Then in October of 2020, a paper was written by Aaron Wes Mitchell. And Mitchell, who had been a senior foreign diplomat in Trump's State Department, wrote this paper that basically laid out the strategy that what we need to do is use Ukraine as a wedge, attack Russia, defeat Russia, and in Russia's defeat, Russia will be compelled to come to the West, and then we can use Russia against China. That was the strategy. It's laid out in the paper. People can go read it. It's in the national interest, published national interest in August of 2021, but it was submitted to the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessments about 11 months earlier. So this was an actual plan within the U.S. government, a strategic vision that we're going to start a war with Russia, use Ukraine to defeat Russia, and then use the Russians against the Chinese. This stuff it's sick. It's diabolical. It's something, you think I'm making this up. Not my word. Right. Just go read it. It's in black and white. And A. Wes Mitchell can then come and argue why he didn't mean it. But it is what it is.
There's been quite a few assessments of where Russia goes from here as it relates to Scandinavia. Now, countries like Finland and Sweden now into NATO, of course. I think, a huge mistake expanding right up to Putin's doorstep. How do you foresee this affecting NATO and Russia going forward? And I've said, and I don't know if I'm wrong about this, but the Arctic Circle, the supply routes, the shipping routes through the Arctic Circle will be maybe the battleground of the future. And having NATO now sitting there surrounding Russia to the north through these incredibly important shipping lanes.
Sure.
The United States is woefully underprepared for that. I think, we've covered on the show how we had like one ice cutting ship under the first administration with President Trump. think Rex Tillerson talked about that. We had like one Coast Guard ice cutting ship. That's it. So by all accounts, Russia is really staking its claim right now in the Arctic. Do you believe Scandinavia, the Arctic, is maybe the battleground of the future?
I'll say no for this reason, because Russia has such a decided advantage. The West can't catch up. Russia's got 40 icebreakers. Okay, the United States only has one, maybe two, and it takes the U.S. usually 3 to 4 years to build one. Russia
Wow.
keeps producing them at a rate. Russia's already coordinating with China on securing those routes. That's one of the reasons Trump, wants to try to get Greenland. But again, getting it we don't have the military infrastructure to back it up. The biggest threat with respect to the Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark is whether or not Russia whether they're going to try to shut down Russia's access to the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, from the Baltic Sea. If they do that, then Russia will fight, and Russia will destroy those NATO navies. The problem NATO has is, despite all the hype that NATO is as united as it's ever been, or stronger than it's ever been, it's just the opposite. NATO is now weaker than at any time in its history. Its militaries, it has no depth of supply with respect to weapons, tanks, armored personnel carriers, combat aircraft. Russia has basically shown that it could exhaust the ability of the West to resupply troops in the course of this. Then you had the internal divisions with Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia no longer fully on board. You've got Britain and France talking tough, but their internal economic situations are dire, and militarily it's even worse in terms of they can't even match the troop strength. Think about this: Russia they are recruiting more troops in 2 months than are in the entire British Army. Okay, so Britain can't even match that, and nor the French, nor the Germans. So they're trying to provoke a confrontation with Russia. And what's really sort of sad and sick about all of this is we're on the eve of the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory over the Nazis. And we've had to endure just incredibly stupid comments by Donald Trump that, oh, the United States won that war. Sorry. The United States in the European theater, in terms of combat losses, we lost a grand total of 189,000 killed in action in the entirety of the war. That's North Africa and the European theater. The Russians lost over 800,000 combat fatalities in just the Battle of Stalingrad alone. The Russians endured between 8 and 11 million combat casualties and soldiers, but more importantly and more telling is up to 19 million civilians were killed by the Nazis and by their collaborators from Romania and Hungary. So this is something the Russian people have not forgotten. And the Russians inflicted 80% of the casualties that the Germans endured during World War II. And one more important fact, the United States killed more German civilians in bombings, over 500,000, some say the estimates is between 600 and 900,000, than we did German soldiers. We only killed 254,000 German soldiers in combat. We spent more time killing civilians than German soldiers. So the United States needs to stop this strutting around like we're the cock of the roost, thinking that we were the biggest, baddest boy on the block during World War II. Simply not true. It's an indulgent, really shameful fantasy that Donald Trump is perpetrating.
Right. Most people don't realize that had it not been for the Battle of Stalingrad and the turning of the tide and actually pushing the Nazis out of Russia, that we finally decided to launch our D-Day strikes. It would not have happened had it not been for what the Soviet Union was able to do and stop them encroaching upon the Soviet Union with
correct
27 million people dying. Yeah, it's unbelievable. At least I'll give credit. I was in Normandy last year at the 80th celebrations there right before that. And at least at the museums on the beaches of Normandy, they do explain the incredible importance of the Soviet Union. So they didn't like whitewash that and kind of keep it out of that. I was actually surprised by that. Larry, I'll get you out of here on this, which is we've been covering on the show the secret deaths of Americans and NATO soldiers inside of Ukraine and the NDAs that families are sort of forced to sign if they want to receive like military benefits for Americans that have been killed in action inside of Ukraine. We've been told all along that no, Americans really aren't involved in Ukraine at all. It's just the Ukrainians. They're brave. What is your assessment from your intelligence sources? How active has the United States Special Forces, U.S. military, and other NATO countries been inside of Ukraine? I'm talking casualties, deaths on the battlefield versus Russia.
We've had a significant presence. Our activity has been more in the realm of directing the combat operations, planning the various moves, directing what the Ukrainians can and cannot do, providing intelligence that's used to attack Russian positions. That article was in the New York Times about a month and a half ago by Adam Entus, laid it out in pretty explicit, great detail of how actual operations, we had Ukrainian commanders sitting in Germany next to U.S. commander, the commander of U.S. European Command, who were actually planning the operations and deciding what was going to be done where and who should do what. Now, there was some friction between them, but the reality is this. Without the United States doing what it has done in terms of supplying weapons, ammunition, intelligence, reconnaissance, without all of that, and then in addition, the personnel on the ground, the coordinating, personnel to operate Patriot missile batteries, personnel to operate HIMARS batteries. Without all of that, Ukraine would have lost this war a long time ago. We've been the major facilitator of it. And Donald Trump, if he was smart, would walk away from it now and beg for forgiveness that we shouldn't have done what we did. And let's get on with restoring relations with Russia. But I think his ego is too big to do that.
Yeah, he said he wants to be the president known for peace. Well, here's your opportunity. Say we made some huge mistakes. Here's what we're going to do. Come to the table and present a peace plan here. Larry, great to see you. I would encourage our audience to go over, we'll link it up down below. Go over to Sonar21, SONAR21.com. That's Larry's website. And go through his incredible articles here and these pieces about NATO and the U.S. expansion into Russia. You've done some great work on this, and hopefully this becomes part of the proper historical record. Larry, great to see you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Clayton. Good to see you.